see actually comes in one form or another from the framework representation itself. This is the framework. It exists as literally hundreds of PowerPoint slides with lots of tables and lots of fine print and all of that stuff. All right, so you've got policy drivers, and they're mapped onto principle-based policy interpretations. And the outputs of those are basically one of two things. They're either permissions, yes you can, no you can't, maybe you can, depending on something else, or they're levels of controls. All right, you need to have authentication of this strength. You need to have storage protection of this strength, that kind of thing. So the framework at this level, at the 1B level, is a whole bunch of two-dimensional tables where the drivers are on the axes and the cells essentially are indicating what the policy requirements are. And so you start to get a sense from this of how this helps us systematically deal with the entire information policy space, because what we've essentially done is constructed a slew of tables which we think appropriately represent that space, and now we've got to worry about what if anything should go in each and every one of those cells. And that tends to focus the mind when you have lots and lots of tables in front of you, knowing that you've got to figure out what goes into each one of those cells. So to go through this example here really quickly, this is an access control decision. Are we going to grant access to particular information? Well, first off, information sensitivity. I'm on that. I'm on this red thing here. So we contrast sensitivity and user category. Okay, in this example, it's a MITRE employee wanting access to highly sensitive personal data. In terms of user type, okay, we've got a conditional yes. But we have to worry about other stuff. We have to worry about context. Platform level of concern, actually we're now calling it system mistrust. Basically, how much do we distrust the platform that this request is coming in from, that the information is going to. In this case, we're saying it's a MITRE-owned platform, so we have a relatively low level of mistrust. We have a reasonable degree of control over it. And so we say, okay, based on the platform, yeah, you can still have access. But wait, we're not done. We have to look at channel vulnerability. The request is coming in over a communications channel of some kind. What's the vulnerability of that channel? Well, in this case, maybe it's the internet. So that's a highly vulnerable channel. And we're accessing, or we're proposing to access highly sensitive information. And what that translates into is an enhanced level of in-transit protection. Finally, we also have to worry about authentication based on the channel vulnerability. Again, this is highly sensitive information going across a highly vulnerable channel. So in addition to the in-transit communication protection, we want a high level, an enhanced level of authentication. We want to make darn sure that the person or the entity that we think is at the other end of this connection is in fact that entity. And if we have all of this, we have the conditional yeses, we have the enhanced channel protection, we have the enhanced authentication. If all of that is true, then we finally come to a decision, yes, we're going to allow that. Now, it's important to note that all of these tables are intended for use by application developers in terms of trying to automate policy enforcement or to appropriately develop infrastructure capabilities. It's for use by policy writers. We're actually developing prose policies which cover maybe 20% of these tables, but they're the 20% which people at MITRE are going to be using 80% of the time. The idea is not that Joe Average or Josephine Average is going to be looking at these things because they are not user-friendly, believe me. All right, so here are the drivers, and you see the three categories I talked about before. And when you select values for these various drivers, and it's not always the case that you need a value for each one of these, depending on the situation. Some of these become irrelevant, and so you don't need a value. But as you select values for these drivers, you are essentially constructing the scenario. That's where the whole scenario business comes from. What the framework helps you do is to systematically and comprehensively construct information policy scenarios by virtue of these various drivers, and then think about, okay, given that this is the scenario sort of formally defined in terms of these drivers, what do my policy requirements have to be? Well, let me just go through some of these drivers very quickly to give you a flavor of them. We had to develop a categorization for information types. The type of information sometimes has relevance for the policies, and so these are the categories we came up with. Most of these are pretty straightforward. I'll mention custodial, contractual. Excuse me. Sometimes MITRE assists the government in source selection, that is, in choosing a vendor for some information technology product. And so as part of that function, we'll get a lot of proprietary information from the different vendors who are bidding for the contract. And so that information has to be protected appropriately. And so that's why that's called out as a separate category. I'll also mention the personal use non-MITRE. Unlike a lot of organizations, MITRE accepts that its employees are going to use MITRE information technology resources on occasion for personal purposes. Okay, I mean, the alternative is to either pretend it's not happening or to try and impose such draconian controls that people aren't going to be able to do their jobs. So we basically said, we're all adults, we're all professionals. We accept that a certain limited amount of appropriate personal use is okay. And given that, we expect, I'm not sure expect is the right word, we recognize that people may put personal information on our systems, which has nothing to do with their jobs, has nothing to do with MITRE. And so that's that last category down here. And we have some policy statements about that. Mainly they're policy statements to the effect of MITRE bears no responsibility for personal information that people willingly put on our systems that MITRE didn't ask for and has nothing to do with their jobs. But we do explicitly recognize it. This is a breakdown of the administrative personal information. We had to come up with a bunch of subtypes because in this area we were dealing with privacy as well as security, and we had to break it down finer. Now, I think most of these are pretty self-evident what they are, but I do want to stress the distinction that we made between MITRE-specific and MITRE-independent personal information. There is personal information which adheres to me in the context of MITRE, which has absolutely no meaning outside of MITRE. My employee number, for example, my office number. There is personal information about me which is independent of MITRE, my social security number, my bank accounts, what have you. And so we made this distinction between the personal information which people ends up adhering to people because they work at MITRE versus the personal information that they carry with them. And that's going to be with them after that was with them before they came to MITRE. It's going to be with them after they leave MITRE. And the reason we do that is because while we may be willing to accept a particular level of residual risk with respect to the MITRE-specific information, because that's information that MITRE generates, we're probably less willing to accept a particular level of residual risk, or actually I should put it another way, we're probably want less residual risk for the MITRE-independent information, because that's personal information that goes with people. We had to define sensitivity levels for our information, and that's based on the impact of information disclosure. Excuse me. And so basically,